Good morning, everybody. I'm here with two Emily Dickinson scholars. I'm Eileen Parks of the Brattleboro Literary Festival and just a quiet fan of Emily Dickinson. So we're here to have a conversation about Emily Dickinson and many subjects that we'll be discussing. Of course, her gardening passion. Will be involved, will be part of that. I have a copy of Martha Ackerman's book, These Fevered Days, the 10 Pivotal Moments in the Making of Emily Dickinson. This is her latest book. And Marta has her book.
Naturally.
Emily's Gardening Life. We were just talking about the long title, The Plants and Places That Inspired Emily Dickinson. So we're going to have a conversation between the two authors after some readings of their current work. And I believe Marta is going to go first.
Sure, I'll be happy to.
After the readings, we have a Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that. And we'll be able to talk to our Emily Dickinson scholars about their work afterwards.
Thanks, Eileen and Martha. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you,
hello, everyone. We can't actually see your faces, but happy half past October. I'm going to do just a little screen share. I wanted to start out with a short seasonal reading. So, as Eileen said, I'm interested in Emily Dickinson as a gardener. I've spent a lot of time on this topic, probably the longest of any topic I've worked on, and a lot of time working in the Dickinson garden in Amherst. So I'm going to show you some pictures from the book and just read you a bit about autumn, since here we are. So here goes. Fingers crossed on the technology, and we'll go from here. Okay. There we go. All right, so there's Emily Dickinson, and Eileen was just talking about how popular she's gotten of late in movies and the new TV series on Apple TV. So, she's sort of in the pop culture right now. And for me as a gardener, I was interested in exploring how she related to the seasons and to nature and specifically to growing things. And so I organized my book along the seasons, talking about her life in plants and as well as what was happening in her garden. So I actually jump back and forth between past tense and present tense, as you'll hear in this section. Autumn in New England has earned its reputation. From her bedroom window, Emily Dickinson could see the trees assume a new palette. The season is fair-haired. Elm trees turn gold and drop. In two early letters, Dickinson used Shakespeare's "the sear, the yellow leaf" to describe the gilding. The season is a siren, turning maples and sassafras leaves to wine and rust. The name of it is autumn. The hue of it is blood. An artery upon the hill, a vein along the road. Great globules in the alleys, and oh, the shower of stain, when winds upset the basin and spill the scarlet rain. It sprinkles bonnets far below. It gathers ruddy pools, then eddies like a rose away upon vermilion wheels. With shorter days and cooler nights, the leaves age and physically senesce. Green chlorophyll starts to dissipate the way a grandparent's skin thins over time. The latent yellows and oranges show through the color chemistry of bananas and carrots. Leafy sugars are triggered to spin new colors like red. The brightest displays come from dry weather and hold until heavy frost. Eventually, the cellular glue weakens to break the bond between stem and plant. The leaves abdicate and fly in Dickinson's vermilion wheels. Small cyclones stir up dried leaves, rifling them like pages in a book. Humidity evaporates, uncovering blue skies. There's a certain smell in the air, dry leaves, wood smoke, with an undertone of crispness. Walking down the flagstone path in the garden, Dickinson noted, "We are by September, and yet my flowers are as bold as June. A strange thing happens when the weather cools in fall. Given a reprieve from the heat, the garden comes out of its August doldrums to have a second flush of bloom." Well, that's the end of the reading, but I'll just close with another brief Dickinson poem and another one of the lovely pictures that the photographer took for this book. "My garden, like the beach, denotes there be a sea. That's summer, such as these. The pearls she fetches, such as me." And I think regardless of the season, Dickinson found pearls to share.
Thank you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to appear with Marta McDowell, who is such a pro and who knows more about Emily Dickinson and Dickinson in the natural world and her gardens than anyone I know. So thank you, Marta, for setting that tone. My book, These Fevered Days, is a biography of Emily Dickinson, but a biography with a twist in that it's not what a lot of people call cradle to grave biographies, pretty large tomes that survey the entire length of an individual's life. Rather, it's snapshots of 10 specific days that changed Emily Dickinson. The days are chronological, but they're not consecutive. So the first one is when she's 14 and she's writing a letter to a friend, and to my ear, I hear Dickinson for the first time. And the days progress from her 20s to her 30s. The last chapter, chapter 10, is the day she died. So my hope is that by focusing on these 10 pivotal moments, that the reader will have a sense of Dickinson's evolution as a poet. But again, the caveat, it does not purport to be a comprehensive biography of all of Dickinson's days. I should also say that the style of the book is narrative nonfiction, in that I use the techniques of storytelling to bring Dickinson's years to light. I try to establish setting. I try to give the reader a sense of the characters in her life. That said, everything is true. For many years, I taught at Mount Holyoke College and taught a course on Emily Dickinson, which I taught in Dickinson's very rooms where she wrote. And I always told my students, when it comes to narrative nonfiction, that if you say the sky is blue, you better have a weather report to back it up. So nothing is made up. I want to give you a little sample of the book. One of the most pivotal days in Emily Dickinson's life, and one that is a chapter, is when Dickinson was in her early 30s and she took the most unprecedented step of her life. She'd been writing poetry. Some had been published, all anonymously, not many, but she hadn't really stepped into the world. And when she was 30, she read an article in the Atlantic Monthly by a man named Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a literary man, an editor, well known nationally, who gave advice to would-be writers. And she wrote him back. And she sent 4 poems. And that started a relationship that was enormously important to Emily Dickinson and lasted for the rest of her life. That was 1862. It wasn't until 1870, 8 years later, when they finally met face to face. And he left a treasure trove of letters that I used that included what Dickinson said, how she looked, how she entered the room. It is the most vivid set of notes we will ever have of what it was like to meet Emily Dickinson up close. So what I'm going to read for you is just a couple of pages that comes from the chapter where Higginson met Emily Dickinson. And the quotes you hear are the quotes that Higginson wrote down after the visit. So I'll come as he comes up the steps. He knocked, presented his card, and was ushered into a dark parlor on the left. Then he waited. First, he heard her. From upstairs on the second floor came the sound of quick, light steps, footsteps that sounded like a child's. Then she entered, a plain woman with 2 bands of reddish hair, not particularly good looking, wearing a white dress. The white stunned him. It was exquisite. A blue worsted shawl covered her shoulders. She seemed fearful to him, breathless at first, and extended her hand not to shake, but to offer something. "These are my introductions," she said, handing him 2 daylilies. "Forgive me if I'm frightened. I never see strangers and hardly know what I say." Once they sat, Emily began talking, and she did not stop. "When I lost the use of my eyes," she had eye problems, she told him, "it was a comfort to me to think there were so few real books that I could easily find someone to read them all to me." She wondered how people got through their days without thinking. "How do people live without any thoughts?" she said. "There are people in the world. You must have noticed them on the street. How do they live? How do they get the strength to put on their clothes in the morning?" She was full of aphorisms, sentences that seemed to have been crafted earlier in her mind that she wanted to share. Women talk, men are silent. That is why I dread women. At times, Emily seemed self-conscious and asked Higginson to jump in, but every time he tried, she was off again, and the words tumbled out almost uncontrollably. He tried to recall every phrase, every thought, even her tone, humor, and asides. "My father only reads on Sundays, and he reads lonely and rigorous books." She boasted about her cooking and said she made all the bread for the family, puddings too. "People must have puddings," she said. The way she said pudding, so dreamy and abstracted, sounded to Higginson as though she were talking about comets. Emily said her life had not been constrained or dreary in any way. "I find ecstasy in living," she explained. "The mere sense of living is joy enough." When at last the opportunity arose, Higginson posed the question he most wanted to ask. "Did you ever want a job? Have a desire to travel or see people?" The question unleashed a forceful reply. "I never thought of conceiving that I could ever have the slightest approach to such a want in all future time." Then she loaded on more. "I feel I have not expressed myself strongly enough." Emily reserved her most striking statement for what poetry meant to her, or rather, how it made her feel. "If I read a book, and it makes my whole body so cold no fire ever can warm me, I know that is poetry," she said. "If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only way I know it. Is there any other way?" Emily was remarkable, brilliant, candid, deliberate, mystifying. After 8 long years of waiting, Thomas Wentworth Higginson was finally sitting across from Emily Dickinson of Amherst, and all he wanted to do was listen. Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much. I was writing notes while you were both talking, and what I'd like to offer our participants right now is if you want to put some questions into the Q&A, I'll monitor those and I will feed them along. We had a little pre-talk before the event went live, and not only were we discussing that there seems to be a resurgence in attention on Emily Dickinson, we also seem to be learning more or becoming more aware, especially the passage that you just read, Martha, illustrates how lively she was. I feel like that this image of her as this recluse, you know, walking around with her big dog and her white dress and being very, very solitary is something that people are very, really comfortable with. And we're trying to kind of crack that image a little bit about how, to me, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's just this brilliant genius. It was, of course, very lively and engaged with life. But let's just, both of you, and maybe Martha, you just went, but if you want to jump back in, but I would like to hear from both of you about how, what kind of like quick little examples can we get about how she was so involved with life and not this hermit or recluse that that seems to be so persistent.
Well, you're right. The myths abound, and Dickinson was reclusive. You know, you can't deny that. From the time she was in her 30s until the end of her days, she had the luxury, the economic luxury of living in her family's home and being able to concentrate on her poetry. That said, she wasn't hermetically sealed. And I'll just give one example, and I know Marta can offer many, many more. I mentioned in that brief excerpt that Dickinson talked about her eye problems. We don't know exactly what it was. We think she had, my theory, given her symptoms, is that she had iritis, a problem with the iris of her eyes that we can treat today very easily. But she had to go to Boston and live in a Cambridge boarding house on 2 long sojourns in the 1860s. And when I researched that period, I found out that she was there for Lincoln's reelection, and was there when there were torchlight parades down Mass Ave. I was able to find where her boarding house was and its relationship to where the parades were. I read newspaper articles about this, and she even mentions in a letter to her sister hearing that parade, and said the drums keep drumming for the still man, meaning Lincoln. So we think of her wrongly as outside history. Not connected to the events of her days, but boy, it sure blew my mind to think about Emily Dickinson in a city, living in a boarding house when she's beginning her seclusion, where she has to eat all of her meals, you know, with other people, and then hearing the political noise, literally as well as figuratively, around her with President Lincoln, when his son, I should say, was in law school just down the road at Harvard. So the parade was marching in the direction of Robert Todd. I think that's a pretty vivid example of Dickinson being immersed in her times rather than separate from her time.
Yeah.
And she was really well connected through correspondence. Even later, when she wasn't seeing people face to face, she was a very avid letter writer. You know, they started collecting her letters not long after she died, they being her first editors. And in the complete collection, there's something like 1,000 letters. She also sent people flowers. You know, there are lots of sort of anecdotal stories about people getting maybe a baked good, right? Martha mentioned puddings. I love puddings too. You know, people getting a little cake with a flower on it, or getting a nosegay that she would sometimes deliver into the pews of the church. So, you know, some of her recent researchers put together a book called The Networked Recluse, and another friend said, oh, well, you know, she would have loved Twitter, or, you know, she would have loved social media, because not only did she like to keep in touch with people, she wanted them to get back to her. You know, she felt there was a great responopability to correspondence.
She could be kind of an annoying friend, I always thought, because of the point you just made, Marta, about you know, she was such an avid correspondent and so good at it. I mean, to read Emily Dickinson's poetry without reading her letters as well, which are published, is to really miss a lot. But boy, she wanted you to get back to her right away, and kind of got miffed when you didn't.
Yeah, I think, well, didn't Higginson say something about he was kind of exhausted after conversations with her?
Yeah. After that encounter where they met for the first time, he wrote his wife and said, I'm glad I don't live near her because no one ever drained me of my nerve power more. He was exhausted.
So I'm sure you've all had, had friends like this where they're so intense that you want to go like, well, wait a minute. And I think she was like that. She was so, smart, and she just saw so much.
Yeah.
And she wanted that in return.
Yeah, humming like a tuning fork is how I describe those types of friends. We have a question that kind of relates to this in the Q&A. So why did it take 8 years to meet her with Higginson? And can we get any details about his opinion of the work that she sent?
Sure. The correspondence started in 1862, and they met for the first time in 1870. The big thing was the war. The Civil War intervened. Higginson was a colonel for the Union Army, serving in the Carolinas, and was wounded. Came back home, and and then they started trying to find a time to meet, and he invited Dickinson to come to Boston, where he was going to be attending his Harvard reunion, or when there was a concert he thought that she would be interested in. Oh my, Dickinson is not going to go to Boston to hear a concert. That just wasn't in her constitution at that point. What always struck me as kind of funny about Higginson, the way he kept pitching, can you do this? Can you do that? At one point, he was rather exasperated with all of her declining her invitations, and he said, "Don't you need sea air? Don't you want to come to the seaside during the summer?" No. And then what finally happened is, and then she would say, "Can you come to Amherst?" And days didn't work out. He had an ailing wife. But finally, his brother died, and his brother lived in Deerfield near Amherst. And he had to come to check in on his family, take care of matters. And that was the moment that finally happened, where he could come to Amherst and meet, as he told a friend, his poet. He was knocked out by her poetry, knocked out. But he also, he tried to give her advice. Other people tried to give Dickinson advice, including her sister-in-law. She was always grateful for it. It was astute. She never took it. So I think he pretty quickly realized he was dealing with someone far and away, above any other poetry, I think, that he was used to seeing, that there was something so unique about it, so powerful. So what he finally decided not to offer her in criticism, he offered in constancy and friendship and dependability. And I think that was enormously important to Dickinson. And in fact, in a letter, she said, "You did not realize that you saved my life."
Yeah. I was always curious, and people often ask this of me, Martha, why the daylily? Daylilies, if you can all picture them, those big orange things that bloom all along the roadsides in kind of the middle of the summer. So she comes in with 2 orange daylilies. And, people want to know, well, is it language of flowers? And I don't think so. What do you think, Martha?
I don't think so. I mean, Dickinson certainly knew what a symbol was, and a symbol of many, many sorts, flowers, metaphors, etc. I don't read that into it. I do think she was very intentional about her entrance. Mm. She could be a little dramatic, and here she is coming down the steps in this exquisite white dress. She was wearing white dresses then, almost like an everyday dress. I mean, it wasn't something really, really flashy. If anything, it looked a little informal, probably. I've always liked what you had to say, Marta, about, just the orange against that white, against the blue shawl that she had, is quite striking. So maybe it's more of a fashion statement than it is the language of flowers. I mean, the giving of the daylily is a gift. I mean, that was something that she always did. Daylily is not a orchid. It's very common. I think Dickinson always goes to the common rather than the highfalutin. You know, she always said my barefoot rank is better when talking about publishing. So I like what you had to say about contrast, but I think it was, her entrance was studied. I'm not so sure the flower was, but you might completely disagree with me.
No, I think so. And, you know, she had red hair. So I think, you know, it's like,
Right.
yeah, it was the whole package.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question that I feel like this is my best opportunity to get a little more information about something. When I heard about how she feels about when she reads other people's work, poetry, and blowing the top of my head off, or no fire that would keep me warm. My favorite book is Middlemarch by George Eliot. And I, just like the visuals of her walking around in Cambridge, I love thinking about her reading that book, Genius on Genius. Like, what a moment. Do you have any other information about her experience reading that book? I know there is a statement and she loved it, but just curious if two Dickinson scholars.
Oh, help me here, Mark. She had Dickinson was such a reader and very, very familiar with the contemporary literature of the day, which was super stuff. I mean, Middlemarch, Bronte's, but
Dickens.
I think I'm confusing this quote with the Brontes. What a day for heaven when the Brontes entered there, right, Marta?
I think so. I think so. I would also have to look it up. But correct me if I'm wrong, Martha, George Eliot is among the people on her bedroom wall. Isn't that right? It's Elizabeth Barrett Browning and George Eliot.
Right.
And I should know that because I did sit there writing.
Mm-hmm.
If any of your participants don't know this, you can, it sounds a little funny, but you can rent the Emily Dickinson bedroom by the hour. Only for writing, I might add, when the museum is open. And I think at the moment, because of the pandemic, it is not open. But it was really an amazing experience to sit there on a winter day. You know, they set you up with a card table, you know, where you're not going to harm anything. But to just absorb the house sounds and the sounds of the town, you know, imagining replacing the sounds of automobile traffic with the sounds of, you know, horse traffic. But really, it's a very similar feeling, I think. Martha, did you have that feeling as well?
Yes, I did the same thing. I set up the card table, and for an hour I brought my laptop and didn't so much write as do exactly what you just described. I listened. I wanted to know how the train sounded, which is just a block away from Dickinson's house. I wanted to look out the windows and see what she saw. Because I've lived in Amherst for so long, over 40 years, and taught a course in the Dickinson Museum. I know the great folks at who run the Emily Dickinson Museum well, as you do too, Marta. They're kind and generous and wonderful. And for certain scenes in the book, I asked the folks there if I could get into some spaces that were not on the tour. For example, when Dickinson comes back from being treated for her eye disorder in Cambridge, the doctor told her she shouldn't read books. She hadn't been reading books, that it was a strain on her eyes. And so the first thing she did when she came back was she wanted to read Shakespeare. And she thought about where could she read it and read it out loud. You know, I think she really wanted to proclaim literature, and maybe in a space that wasn't too bright, to had too much sunlight to interfere with her sight. So she went up to the attic of the house, and so I called the Dickinson Museum and said, "Can I get up in the attic? I want to see what I can see. I want to read some Shakespeare up there. I want to hear how it sounds." Now, it's been changed a little bit since Emily Dickinson's time, but not all that much. So it was a wonderful experience. And I think it demonstrated to me yet again how much that house informs Emily Dickinson's work. Her perspective, her literal view outside the window, even the echoes of those rafters up in the attic. It was really important for my own research to gather that kind of information. I'll always be grateful that I had the experience.
I was curious when I was reading your book, Martha, you picked the number 10, 10 pivotal moments. I wondered what was the 11th that you thought about including but didn't make the cut.
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you. Yeah, 10 was just a round number, and I'll tell you one chapter that was supposed to be in there, but I had to throw out once I realized that it didn't work. And that was a chapter that dealt with Emerson. I've always been interested in the connection between Dickinson and Emerson. And I think his essays informed her work a great deal, not so much his poetry, which isn't very good. But Dickinson's cousins, Fanny and Louise Norcross, who she was quite close to, lived in Concord, just down the road from Emerson. And I discovered that they were in this group together called the Saturday Club. And it was a group of people very interested in literature. You had to be nominated and then voted on to be in the club, to meet once a month to talk about writing. And so I found these records of Dickinson's cousins hosting a person was in attendance, as well as the Alcotts, Bronson and Louisa May, where the cousins read poetry of someone whose nature was of too private a spirit, something like that, to go public. Boy, that sounds like Emily Dickinson to me. And that is Dickinson and Emerson coming right together. But I realized that it wouldn't work in terms of the narrative of the book, because Dickinson wasn't at that meeting. Mm-hmm. So she would be off stage for 30 pages, and you just can't have that. You've got to keep her there and keep the reader engaged with what she was doing. So that's probably the 11th chapter that I still love, because I love that idea of Dickinson and Emerson, but I had to throw out because she wasn't in the room.
Well, maybe there's a whole book in the Saturday Club.
Oh, I think there is. I'm kind of a one and done girl, so I'm not going to go back to Emily Dickinson with another book, but boy, the records are at the Concord Free Public Library for the Saturday Club. It's great stuff.
Well, it's very interesting because at one point I pitched to my editor the idea of a book about the connected gardening interests of the Concord crowd, because they really did. I mean, it was sort of stunning. So, Emily Dickinson, probably most of the participants are New Englanders, but if anyone isn't, Amherst and Concord, they're not right next door, but they're not that far away, mm-hmm. particularly in Dickinson's day, and in the day of the hotbed of transcendentalism, mm-hmm. they were connected by train. So mm-hmm. they were really almost as close as they are today. So I said, we had Hawthorne was there and Emerson was there and Thoreau was there and the Alcotts were there. And my editor said, well, I'd buy it, but I don't think anyone else would. So that was the end of that book idea.
Well, make it two. I will buy it too. I was out in Concord on Thursday, as a matter of fact, and boy, I went down the so-called Battle Road, past Hawthorne, Alcott, Emerson, and you just see the proximity of everyone's house. It really is astonishing.
So Emerson was also right next door one day, at least, right, to Emily Dickinson, coming back to our topic of the day. And if I show that picture of the bedroom, if you imagine her looking out the windows that faced west, those windows looked out onto her brother's house. I was going to say her brother's property, but actually her father didn't give it to the brother until the father died. So it was actually still her father's property, but her brother's house. And her brother and sister-in-law entertained many, many amazing people. They were sort of the social and cultural center of Amherst. And so Emerson, among other people, came there. You know, for me, a particular interest was also Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted, the designers of the Emerald Necklace and Central Park. They were at the brother's house several times. And so you go, wow, what a shame, you know, she didn't meet these people. Because again, at that point, she had gotten more reclusive.
Yeah, and that they didn't meet her. We have another question that it's pretty related. Actually, another one just came in, but so the Saturday Club, we were talking about that, and a question came in. Do you have any information about what other poets of the time, how they reacted to her work when they had a chance
to her work? That I don't know. It's a good question. If you read, well, Helen Hunt Jackson, and Martha can talk a lot more about Helen Hunt Jackson, but Helen Hunt Jackson was a hugely successful author of the day, novels as well as poems. I still remember my mother reciting a Helen Hunt Jackson poem that starts, "The goldenrod is yellow." It's a poem about September. I think of it every September. Helen Hunt Jackson was in love with Emily's poems and wanted to be her literary executor. She really, of all of the people, of her contemporary literary people, I think Helen Hunt Jackson is the one that should get the nod for totally recognizing Dickinson's value. And I'll pass it off to Martha because she does much better than I do.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And actually, one of the things I wanted to do with my book was to plant Helen Hunt Jackson more firmly in Dickinson's story. Helen Hunt Jackson is a name we're not all that familiar with now, but she was one of the most celebrated writers in the 19th century, not only of poetry, but of fiction and of nonfiction treatises. She was one of the first to write a book about the unconscionable treatment of Native Americans. And then which led to some important legislation. So she was just one firebrand. And as it turned out, Dickinson and Helen Hunt Jackson were girlhood friends. They both grew up in Amherst together, just a little more than a mile away. So just to echo what Marta said, and that is that they were girlhood friends, and then Helen Hunt Jackson moved away and had a very tragic life, lost a husband, lost all of her children to illness, both of her sons. And then she happened to be in a boarding house where who should be in the boarding house as well but Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the man who then met Dickinson. And so he said, wait a minute, you two know each other? And he kind of put them back together and in touch with each other. And Helen Hunt Jackson was just so impressed by Dickinson's work. They began writing. Dickinson would send her poetry. And then she came back and had a long meeting with Dickinson when she tried to twist her arm, the poet's arm, to give her one of her poems for a book of poetry that was coming out. And very famously, Helen Hunt Jackson writes in a letter to Dickinson, she said, "It is a wrong to your day and time that you do not publish. You will be sorry when you are what men call dead, that you were so stingy." So, you know, it's important to realize for people who are coming to Dickinson kind of for the first time, Dickinson wrote nearly 2,000 poems, but only published a handful in her lifetime, all anonymously. So, you know, you really can't ask what did Poe think about Dickinson's poetry, because he wouldn't have seen it if you're talking about her contemporaries. But when the first edition of her poems came out in 1890, 4 years after her death, they had to immediately print another edition and another edition. They were met with great interest.
Hey, we've had some more participants come in, so we're suggesting maybe could you hold your books up again and just We are talking with Martha Ackerman, author of These Fevered Days, 10 Pivotal Moments in the Making of Emily Dickinson. And we are also with Marta McDowell. And
I'll correct you on my name, my last name, Eileen. It's Ackmann with no ER. People are going to be Googling it. Don't stick the ER in there.
you get a lot of it, you do.
And this is, Marta did that lovely slideshow earlier on and showed a photograph of Emily Dickinson's bedroom. And that's the wallpaper in the bedroom is what's on my book. That's
yeah. There's so many book designers are really in for a treat if they get the job of creating the cover for these books. And
yes, in fact, I was very jealous when I saw Martha's cover, because like titles, authors rarely have any say in dust jacket art. But the designer of my book did use it as well in the chapter splits, along with this kind of idea of an envelope. Now, the reason why they used the envelope is that Dickinson, in addition to copying out many of her poems in fair hand, I think that's the right term, she also scribbled lots of poems on pieces of paper that were around. So that included envelopes that she had opened up, backs of chocolate wrappers, receipts. So those are actually all in the collection of Amherst College in special collections. And there have been editions of those put out recently that are really amazing.
You know, it's so interesting, Marta, to see the use of that wallpaper. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of it too in books, and because it's so lovely, and it also goes against one of the myths we were talking about. Dickinson is this feral person. The wallpaper is beautiful, so lively, that rose and the pinks and the greens. I know I was teaching in my Holyoke seminar in the room opposite Dickinson's bedroom when they discovered the wallpaper. The walls had been in this kind of white, sterile wallpaper, and they were taking down the molding at the top and found a scrap of this, and they were able to reproduce it and get it going. And but for me, it was it's really a shock to walk into that bedroom after remembering it as being so white and almost cold, and then you have this vibrant wallpaper. It's just gorgeous.
Yeah, she really was writing in a garden as well. I do see a very wonderful question, which I am going to answer, even though it's a bit self-serving, is should you buy the new edition of my book? I did write a book called Emily Dickinson's Gardens in 2005. This one is hugely redone, as you could probably just tell from the edition. So you'll recognize some of the words. I did use some of the content again, but put in a lot of new and reworked it. It was like, you know, I always say I got a second chance in life, you know, probably for the first and last time.
well, our time's winding down. I wonder if I could leave both of you with a final question for you to answer. So Emily Dickinson as a gardener, if you wanted to kind of connect with her through her plants, what would be some plants that you would recommend for people? And I guess we can only recommend New England zones because that's where she, but what would you recommend as a plant to have in your own garden?
Okay, there are three of them actually. One of them is the daylily, because she loved daylilies. Another is the daisy. Occasionally she would reference the daisy or herself as the daisy. Daisy shows up in poems, including the one about seeing New Englandly. And the third is the rose. Of all of the plants, the most frequently mentioned in her letters and her poems is the rose. They grew a lot of old-fashioned roses. And so that's one thing we've been doing of late in the Dickinson garden, is reintroducing some of those antique rose varieties, which are still available.
Yeah.
Well, I completely defer to Marta on that, but I'll just pipe in with one thing. Plant an apple tree. The Dickinsons had a a nice little orchard at the end of their property. And Dickinson's sister, who, boy, we haven't touched on her this morning, but she played a very large role in Emily Dickinson's life, and is the reason we have the poems, because she found them after her death. Her favorites were Baldwins. She said Vinnie loves Baldwins, so plant a Baldwin apple tree.
Yes, and go out and pick some right now. All those old-fashioned varieties that you can still get in the orchards, but not so much in the food stores.
Yeah, we have Scott Farm in Dummerston near Brattleboro, where we can get Baldwins and other things. And yeah, and the growers there have connected some of those apples with some other people we know that which one Thoreau liked, the sheep's nose. So now we know that Emily liked the Baldwin. Excellent.
Yeah, Baldwin, Sweetings. There are quite a few.
Yeah.
All listed in my book.
Yeah.
Joanne, I see, has a question about poets at the time. The one I will add is she loved Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So if you want to read Emily Dickinson's favorite poet, I'd say start with Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
Well, it's just been so wonderful just kind of being awash in Emily's presence. And I encourage everybody to read the books, read some Emily Dickinson poetry. Never a bad idea. Thank you so much for sharing.
Eileen, did you have a place where people could order books?
Yes, yeah, we do. And I believe our producer is going to be able to put that up in the Q&A. We do have a link for that.
Also, support your local booksellers. You've got a local bookshop.
Yeah, we have everyone's books here in town and some other ones. And we will provide the link in the chat for people where they can get both of your books. They're both available in print. So thank you very much. It was just extraordinary to just think about her. It can't not be inspirational, no matter what. Gardener or just a lover of words. Here we have a bookshop.org link from Brattleboro Literary Festival. So bookshop, I can say that bookshop.org is a really wonderful place to order books from. I've really enjoyed it ever since they emerged. So please give them your business. You'll really enjoy that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Always good to see you, Marta.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a terrific day. Bye-bye.